When your body gets frightened or scared in a moment, it triggers what is known as the acute stress response, or popularly known as fight or flight. And so you can get all sorts of different reactions and behaviors as a result of that. There's this story that I think is somewhat amusing. One time, my friend Declan and I were traveling. We were actually, as it happens, we were visiting the church in Brackett, and we were staying with one of the elders there, Howard, and he's got kind of a loft area in the top of his home, and he told us that we could sleep up there. And there was a recliner and there was a bed. And so Declan and I made a deal that I would take the bed and he would take the recliner. I like this deal, right? But there was a caveat to this. I told him, I snore very loudly and I know it. So if you're not able to fall asleep within 30 minutes, wake me up. You'll take the bed. I'll go downstairs and I'll just sleep on the couch. Well, he didn't fall asleep. So he woke me up. Now, the thing is, I don't wake up very gently. I wish I did, but I don't. And so he barely touched me, just trying to wake me up, barely touches me. And I bolt upright in terror, clutching my chest, and I think I terrified him as much as I was scared. And so there you go. That's the acute stress response, right? Just absolute terror in that moment. Now, that was this acute fear in the moment. It was not anything lasting. I was not, still stressed out. An hour later, I was snoring downstairs instead. But I want to talk about a more long-lasting, a deeper set kind of fear that is just as capable of producing these kinds of disparate results. We're going to look at 3 different reactions to fear from the book of Joshua. So go ahead and turn to the book of Joshua. 3 different reactions to fear from Joshua, each of which we're going to follow up with a parable. We're not going to go read the whole parable. We're just going to reference it, talk about it. You can write it down, look it up later. This lesson is very text heavy, so we're going to spend a lot of time reading. Our first example comes from Joshua chapter 10. If you want to turn there. Joshua 10. And our first example is the 5 Amorite kings. In Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, we read, "Now it happened that when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had devoted it to destruction, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, they feared exceedingly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty." So, here we go. Adonizedek, he's king of Jerusalem. In the next verse, we're going to read about 4 other kings. But his fear here is about Joshua's military prowess. He's worried because Joshua is a great commander, he's a great general, and he's having military success. And his fears have become emboldened because the Israelites have made peace with the Gibeonites, who are also mighty in some way. Maybe they were great warriors too, I don't know. But he's become worried about this alliance. And you'll notice here that there is nothing written about fear of the Lord or fear of the Lord's power, despite the fact that the Lord is the one granting these military victories here. And that's their first problem. Their first problem is that their fear is misplaced. Their fear is not a fear of the Lord and of his power, but it is only a fear of man and what man can do. But man can change, man can be overcome, and God cannot. So this first kind of fear that we see here is always going to lead to defeat. It's always going to be overcome because it stems from pride. So if you are in sin, God is against you. You don't need to be worried about what other Christians are going to think about you. You don't need to be worried about what the preacher might say. You need to be worried about how God perceives your situation, how God is going to deal with you. Now, the Amorites here are pagans. They're wicked. God is sending Joshua through to destroy them precisely because of their wickedness and unwillingness to submit to God. And that's why their fear has nothing to do with God. They're not afraid of the God of the Israelites. They're not afraid of Yahweh. And we read about their reaction in verses 3 through 5. Therefore, Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Deber, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us strike Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, king of Hebron, king of Jarmuth, king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, encamped by Gibeon, and fought against it. So their solution to their fear is a fear of man, not a fear of God. Their solution is to team up together and fight. This fear leads to fighting. Now, they trust in other humans, in this case, these other kings, in each other, to help their cause. And Adonizedek thought that if they formed this alliance, this military coalition, they were going to be able to defeat Joshua. And if God wasn't involved, he probably would have been right. But unfortunately, he was involved. They were wrong, and fighting did them no good. If God isn't in your picture, you might think that you can get past, you can beat in conversation, whatever it may be. You can beat the people who are the religious people who are telling you that you're living wrong, but you're never going to overcome God. You're never going to get past him. And you may be surprised in the end. And that's what happens at the end of this chapter, verses 22 through 26. Then Joshua called for them, I'm looking at the wrong chapter, sorry. Verse 22. Then Joshua said, Open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. And they did so and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave. The king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon. Now it happened that when they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, Come near and put your feet on the necks of these kings. And so they came near and put their feet on their necks. Joshua then said to them, Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight. And so afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. The Amorite kings were killed by Joshua, but defeated by God. He was the one who led to this victory, this great victory. In fact, this is the story within Joshua where Joshua has that great moment where he prays to God to have the sun stand still so that they'll have extra time to fight, right? That's not something that Joshua was able to do on his own. This victory did not come from Joshua's power. It came from God. And that was not something that the pagans could anticipate. Now, I want to think about a parable. The parable of the landowner. Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 41. The parable of the landowner. What happens in this particular parable is that the landowner, who represents God, he owns this field and he lets it out to basically tenants who are going to take care of it. and he sends his servants to collect payment from them, to get back what, the proceeds from what was sold. And those servants represent the prophets whom God had been sending this whole time. Now, each time one of these servants comes to the tenants, they take them and they beat them and they send them back in shame. And eventually, God, the landowner, sends his son, Jesus, as the final messenger, the final prophet, to collect this payment. And they do the same thing with him, and they even kill him, right? And the point of this particular parable is that they were still stuck in this same kind of framework. They had no fear of the landowner. All they saw was the messenger who was in front of them. And we can do the same thing today. We can do the same thing when we don't see the power behind the message, but instead we only see the people who are bringing that message to us. When we see Christians who confront us, or maybe you hear my words, you may just see a person. But when the authority comes from Scripture, it ultimately comes from God. And when we miss out on that, when we fail to see that, and our fear is not placed properly in God, we're not going to heed those words. And that's the problem that we see. It is a problem that we can deal with in the church. But God is going to judge us not only based on how we respond to Scripture, but how we respond to his servants, including their writings within Scripture. Our second example here, so the first kind of fear, that fear will lead you to fighting. The second kind of fear will lead you to fraud. So we're actually going to turn back a chapter and look at chapter 9. Maybe I should do chapter 9 and then chapter 10 so I don't get confused, but regardless, I've done it in this order. So chapter 9, this example is the Gibeonites themselves. We can read about them starting in verse 3. It says, the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai. So if we pause right there, we see the same thing as with the Amorites, right? They've seen what Joshua has done in the land. But we're going to skip down. I want you to read verse 24. This is the words of the Gibeonites. Verse 24. It was certainly told to your slaves that Yahweh your God, the Lord your God, had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore, we feared greatly for our lives because of you and have done this thing. We're going to read about what it is that they do in a moment. But their fear, they've seen what Joshua did, but they understand more deeply. They understand it's not just Joshua and his military prowess. They see that God is behind this, that the God of the Israelites has given this land over to that people, and their fear is of God himself. But again, it's not complete. This is not what we're going to refer to as a fear of the Lord. They're not coming to God in submission. Let's see actually what their fear does. Notice that they never in here acknowledge God as Almighty. They never claim him as their own God. Start in verse 4. So they acted craftily and went and traveled as envoys and took worn out sacks on their donkeys, and wineskins worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and was crumbled. And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a far country, so now cut a covenant with us. Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, so that's who they are, they're part of the group known as the Hivites, perhaps you are living within our land, how then shall we cut a covenant with you? But they said to Joshua, we are your servants. Then Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? They said to him, your servants have come from a very far country, because of the fame of Yahweh your God. For we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon king of Heshbon and to Og king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions in your hand for the journey and go and meet them and say to them, you're your servants, now then cut a covenant with us. This bread of ours was warm when we took it for our provisions out of our homes on the day we left to come to you, but now behold, it is dry and has become crumbled. And these wineskins which we filled were new, and behold, they are torn. And these clothes of ours and our sandals are worn out because of the very long journey. So the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask for the command of the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and cut a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. All right. This is an interesting story, right? So what we have here is the Gibeonites. They're very clever. This is really a very clever idea. It's not right, but it's clever. They come to this conclusion. They see the power of God. They see what he's doing. And they say, we want to not be killed because we know that's going to happen to us. So they have, it's not, we're not going to call it faith, right? But it's almost like faith. They trust that God is going to defeat them if they get into a battle. They see what he's doing. They see that he's mighty and he's powerful, and they're afraid. They are terrified of this God. And they say, we need to get ahead on this. So they try to cut this covenant, and they're actually successful, right? They were able to con the Israelites into signing a treaty with them, right? A peace treaty. And this works. Now, here's the problem. They're trying to work around God. They think that their plot is going to get them out of trouble with God because they make peace with the people, so maybe they'll be okay with their God too. Now, I actually think this, not the first one, is the kind of fear that is most likely to plague us as Christians. Not because we're going to try to do some elaborate scheme like this, right? But what they're trying to do is they're trying to hide. They're trying to get around God's knowledge, basically. Trying to outsmart God. And sometimes we do that. This is the same kind of fear that we see in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve try to hide from God. Because it comes from not trusting God. Fearing God without trusting him is not faith. They fear God, they see his power, and they're worried about it. They're concerned about it, but they don't really trust him. They do not have, there's no idea that comes into their minds that they can come to this God and submit to him, and he is going to let them live in peace. Now, I want you to notice the results of this. The results of this are very interesting. I want you to look at verses 22 through 27. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them. In the meantime, basically, they figured out that it was a lie. Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying, we are very far from you, when you're living nearly in the midst of us? So now you are cursed, and you shall never be cut loose from being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. So they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told to your slaves that Yahweh your God has commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we greatly feared for our lives because of you and have done this thing. So now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Thus he did to them and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day, in the place which he would choose. The Gibeonites were spared by Joshua, but they were rejected by God. That wasn't the only possible outcome for them, but that's what they brought upon themselves. They became slaves in perpetuity, basically. Now, what does that look like as Christians? This narrative reminds me of the parable of the talents. In Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30, we read about the parable of the talents. And what happens there is God is once again a master, a landowner of some kind. And he's got 3 stewards, and he gives each of them a responsibility. And he gives to each of them a quantity of money. These are the talents. It's a coin. And he gives to one man a single talent to take care of and to be a steward over. He gives to the next man 5 talents, and he gives to the next man 10 talents. Okay. Now, what each of those men then do with those talents is the man with 10 talents, he goes and he invests it and he doubles it. And the man with 5 talents, he goes and he invests it and he doubles it. But the man with 1 talent is afraid of God. He's afraid of the master. And so he takes it and he hides it because he doesn't want anything to happen to it. He doesn't want it to get damaged. He doesn't want it to get lost. So he never does anything. And so when God comes back and he's checking on the results, he asked this man, why didn't you invest it like the other 2? Why did you hide it? And the man who had the 1 talent tells him, because I knew you, that you are a hard man. And basically he says, I knew that you're the kind of man, God, who punishes those who do not obey his will. The Gibeonites understood that, but they didn't trust God. The man who had the 1 talent didn't trust God. He understood the power of God, the might of God, but he didn't understand the love and the mercy of God. And this is why I say this is what we're most susceptible to as Christians. Because sometimes we focus so much on the power of God and his wrath and his judgment that we're just scared of God. We just live in fear of him. We don't really trust him. We let the guilt of our sins wear away at us rather than believing he can eventually forgive us. But it leads them to punishment. They're never able to become part of the congregation of Israel. They're never able to reap the blessings that God has for those he is in covenant with. That's our 3rd example. Our 3rd example comes from Joshua chapter 2. I know, we're moving even farther back in the book. Joshua chapter 2. You might have guessed this one already. Our 3rd example is Rahab. Joshua chapter 2. Let's read verses 8 through 11. Now before they lay down, I should probably give a little bit of background, right? So the 2 spies have gone into the city of Jericho, and they have found the home of this woman. She's a prostitute. Why they were there makes me curious. But they decided that she was a good place to hide, and she offers to hide them while they're in the city. She hides them, and then verse 8, before they lay down for the night, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. Indeed, we heard it and our hearts melted, and a courageous spirit no longer rose up in any man because of you. For Yahweh your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Rahab not only expresses fear of God, she doesn't just recognize his might and his power, but she acknowledges him as the God of all creation. She then chooses to appeal to his mercy. Verses 12 through 14. She says, "So now please swear to me by Yahweh, by the Lord, since I have shown loving kindness to you, that you will also show loving kindness to my father's household, and give me a pledge of truth, and preserve my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters alive with all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death." And so the men said to her, "Our life for yours, if you do not tell this business of ours. And it will be, when the Lord gives us the land, we will show loving kindness and truth to you." She doesn't just acknowledge God's power and his might. She recognizes God's love and his mercy, and she appeals to it. And that's the scary thing about faith, is that we're not just trusting in the judgment of God. We have to understand that and appreciate that. That's where it starts. But we also have to understand and trust his love and mercy. Because if we don't, it's never going to turn into true faith. Instead of trying to work against God and instead of trying to deceive God in some way, she determines she's going to work with God, because she believes that God will spare her for her righteousness. And as a result, in chapter 6, verse 21, we find that the Israelites devoted to destruction everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox, sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Verse 25, however, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had, Joshua preserved alive. Listen to this. And she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. She was spared by Joshua and accepted by God. It's not just that she was allowed to live within the confines of the territory as a slave, like the Gibeonites, but she was accepted by God for her faith, for her trust in his love and mercy. She was allowed to become part of the congregation of Israel, and one of her descendants is Boaz, as we find out in the book of Ruth. She was accepted into the congregation. So then what's the relevance for us? The parable this makes me think of is the parable of the two sons. In the parable of the two sons, there's a father who tells his sons both to go out into the field and to work in it. And the first son says, "Okay, I'll do that, because you're my father and that's my job." So he goes out into the field. Second son says, there's no way, I don't feel like doing that. But after some moment of time, they both have a change of heart. And the first son, who said he was going to go out and work in the field, decides he doesn't feel like it anymore. And so he doesn't. And the second son, who was initially too lazy to go work, has a change of heart and says, "I need to obey my father." And he goes back and he works in the field. That's because God will judge us based on how we follow his commands. Jesus asked the disciples which of the two did the will of his Father, and they said, The first, I had them out of order. The one who said he would not go into the field, but eventually he did. And that's what happens with Rahab. Initially, she was living this life of wickedness. She was a pagan, just like everyone else we've looked at this evening. But she had a true change of heart, and she committed herself to serving God. And as a result, she was able to reap the benefits of God's love and mercy. The kind of fear of God that leads to faith, that leads to obeying Him, to trusting in Him, submitting to Him, is the only kind that will lead to salvation and reward. And as long as our attitude is against God or does not truly trust God, we rebel against Him, we try to hide from Him, we're never going to receive those blessings. But when we learn to obey God, to trust and to submit to Him, then we will reap those blessings. I hope that we all have a fear of God this evening. But I hope that that fear does not corrupt your mind or turn you against God, but rather turns you toward Him in trust and in love. If you have any need, please come forward while we stand and sing.